morning. Welcome to the Los Angeles World Affairs Council and Town Hall. I'm Kim McClary, President and CEO, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you to today's program. We are also so excited about bringing back our in-person events, beginning with an exclusive members-only tour of a new exhibit at the Skirball Center this July. We also announced yesterday that we are providing our members with a free subscription to the Daily Chatter. This is an international newsletter that arrives daily, written by top journalists around the world. So if you aren't a member, please consider joining by visiting our website. For those of you who would like to ask Dan questions, there's a control panel on the right-hand side of the screen where you can type in your questions. Jessica DeGanzik, our Vice President of Events, will be managing your questions during the Q&A portion, which will start in about 35 minutes. It's now my great pleasure to bring on Professor Dan Schnur. Dan, you've got three terrific topics again this week.
Oh, thank you, Kim. As always, it's a busy week, but I think hopefully it'll be a good conversation.
Well, we get so much positive feedback on your weekly programs that we so appreciate your time and expertise. But let me get to your questions right away. The first one, next steps on COVID, a pandemic status report. Number two, is it possible to have a January 6th commission? And third, what to expect from Biden's first overseas trip? So take it away, Dan. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Kim. And thanks especially for your nice words. And thanks to all of you, as always, for taking the time to join us on Tuesday mornings. We're going to be sending out a survey, as I understand it, at some point in the near future to gauge whether continuing midday programs makes sense or not, or whether your schedules as we begin to move out of COVID would be better suited for an evening program. But either way, we'll look forward to continuing to talk with you as we go forward. And as Kim said, the first topic we're going to discuss today, of course, is a COVID update. This program is known as Politics in the Time of Coronavirus, and it's been some time since we've revisited our namesake. So I thought it'd be worth taking some time at the beginning of today's program to take a broader look at where we are as a state, as a country, and as a world as we move closer, hopefully, toward a post-COVID landscape. Now, 1 week from today, California will officially reopen, sort of. Governor Newsom has announced that will be the day, June 15th, that those of us who've been vaccinated will no longer have to wear masks in public settings. But on Friday, Newsom announced that the state of emergency that he proclaimed last spring would not cease on June 15th and would continue for the foreseeable future. So on one hand, we know that vaccinated people won't have to wear masks anymore, although there are exceptions in some workplaces, and that gets even more complicated. But if the emergency is not over, then what does that mean about the threat? Well, my best guess is that Newsom wants to keep his emergency powers, not because of a renewed COVID threat, but because that additional authority that a governor has in times of emergency allows him to make decisions unilaterally without involving the state legislature. And that's a much easier way for any governor to move forward, but it does send some mixed signals, and we'll keep an eye on this going forward for you, of course. In any case, we thought that this sort of reopening would be a good opportunity to look back and to look ahead to see where we are taking on this extraordinary menace that we've all weathered together over the last 14, 15 months. First, the good news. The United States has brought new coronavirus infections down to the lowest level since March of last year when the pandemic began. The US averaged roughly 16,500 new cases per day over the past week. And that's a 30% improvement over the week before. New cases declined in 43 of the 50 states and held steady in the other 7. So that's the good news. On the other hand, since last spring, roughly 33 million Americans and that's about 10% of our country's population, have tested positive for COVID-19. About 600,000 people tragically have died from the virus in the United States. And that makes the coronavirus deadlier for Americans than the past 80 years of wars and other armed military conflicts combined, including World War II. So here's the bottom line. The US largely failed to contain the virus until the vaccines arrived. Now, cities and businesses, as you all remember, began shutting down last March. From there, the virus rolled into a second wave last summer, when cases climbed over 65,000 per day, and hospitals in many parts of the country were overwhelmed. That failure got even worse over the winter, when hundreds of thousands of people per day were contracting COVID, and deaths went up to over 3,000 per day for about a month earlier this year. But now, happily, the virus really is under control nationwide and in just about every state, thanks almost entirely to the vaccines. Now, just over half of American adults are now fully vaccinated, according to the CDC. But over time, the immunity that's provided from the vaccines is going to diminish, which, together with new variants on the virus, will likely require booster shots for all of us to stay ahead of another outbreak. But for now, at least this country has gotten the virus down, finally, to a level that almost every expert agrees is safe. Fewer than 20,000 cases a day, which still sounds like a lot, but spread across the US population of 330 million people, that's actually a pretty low number of cases. And those numbers continue to improve across the board. But, and it's a big but, the data demonstrates that while we're coming out of the crisis, there's no magic date when it's going to be over and when we'll be free of all worries. So we're making progress. We're making considerable progress, but there's still a long way to go. And the biggest challenges by far are the very large numbers of unvaccinated individuals around the world and here in the United States. Because the more people who don't receive vaccines, the easier it becomes for variants for the virus to emerge. And there's no guarantee that our vaccinations will protect us against all variants. So the more people we vaccinate, the better. And the more likely we come close to that vaunted herd immunity, the less we have to worry about going forward. But we're not there yet. And both cases and deaths are still soaring in other parts of the world, especially in developing nations. And the Biden administration is facing consistently growing pressure to export more vaccines to the developing world. Now, the world reached a vaccination milestone last week, with 2 billion total doses now administered. And the rate of vaccination is speeding up considerably. It took 30 days to go from 500 million vaccinations to 1 billion. It took 24 days to go from 1 billion to 1.5 billion, and just 16 days to go from 1.5 billion to 2 billion. So the pace is picking up, but the vast majority still of those vaccinations are coming in the countries that are either producing vaccines in immense amounts, China, the United States, the European Union, or countries that could afford to buy their way to the front of the line by paying more money than poor countries can afford for the vaccines. And so the emergence of stronger variants of the virus in countries like Brazil and India, and the slowness of vaccination efforts in many places outside the West contributed to very dangerous new waves. Southeast Asia is in the grip of a huge spike in infections. Cases in countries like Thailand and Malaysia and Vietnam have been rising dramatically over the last month. And they are now registering in Malaysia more infections per million people than any country in Asia, even more than India, which of course we've all been reading about in this country. Over in Africa, concerns are growing over the possible arrival of a new wave, powered by a more powerful and a more transmissible variant of the virus. And the health systems in many of those countries are at risk of being overwhelmed by the growth in infections. In parts of Latin America, the virus is still raging. Peru now has the worst COVID-19 mortality rate per capita in the world. And of course, we've read about Brazil quite a bit over the last months. And even in East Asia, where many nations were very successful last year in preventing community spread, the virus is growing there too. Taiwan has seen an explosion of cases over the last month. And in Japan, which still intends to host the Summer Olympics next month, numerous areas, including Tokyo, are under state of emergency. So expanding manufacturing capacity, particularly in the developing world, could help close the gap over time, but that does take time. But for now, attention is falling on the wealthier countries that have purchased far more doses than they need, including the United States. Now, President Biden will lobby a lot of those wealthier countries to increase their pledges, starting at the G7 summit this weekend, and we'll talk more about that later in today's program. But many low-income countries have run into problems, even with the doses that they have obtained, because there's immense logistical challenges in training and deploying health workers, transporting vaccines where they're needed, and communicating effectively about the benefits of vaccination. So believe it or not, coronaviruses worldwide are already higher in 2021 than they were in 2020. And the death toll almost certainly will be higher too by the time we get to the end of the year. Now, the challenge isn't nearly as great here in the US, but we're still seeing very significant vaccine gaps here at home. Most of the most vulnerable people are getting left behind here too. And an average of about 500 Americans a day, it's worth remembering, are still dying from COVID-19. Almost all of them vaccinated, almost all of them unvaccinated. So the vaccination gap is most pronounced in rural areas, and that's been worsening over time. Vaccination rates across counties of all vulnerability levels were similar in December, back when the mass vaccination campaign began. But by the beginning of May, the vaccination rate was less than half in those most vulnerable rural counties, compared to roughly 60% in the rest of the country. Now, the people in vulnerable rural counties are under-vaccinated is especially troubling because many of the US's rural poor are at greater risk of severe COVID, and they've been disproportionately affected by the disease. Now, as you all know, because you've read about this too, vaccine hesitancy is playing a huge part in the vaccination gap. Almost 1/4 of rural Americans say they definitely won't get the vaccine, compared to 15% of suburbanites and 7% of urban residents. Now, some of this disparity comes down to politics, but access is playing a role too. There was an analysis from the University of Iowa recently that shows that there are more than 100 counties in the United States that do not have a single pharmacy that's eligible to provide COVID vaccines. And there's more than 300 additional rural counties in the country that have only one single pharmacy that provides them. But it's not just rural America. The slowdown is national, because every single state is down at least 2/3 of its vaccination rate from its peak a few months ago. The other great challenge is in minority and underrepresented communities. Disparities in vaccinations are contributing to the increased chance of hospitalization and death, particularly among African American and Latinos. African Americans are now about twice as likely, and Latinos about 60% more likely to be hospitalized with COVID than whites or Asian Pacific individuals. African American and Latinos have roughly twice the risk of dying of COVID than whites do. And the differences are even more profound among younger people, Among adults in their 20s or younger, just 24% of Black and 37% of Latino residents have received at least one dose of the vaccine. 24% in African American communities among young people, 37%, just over a third in Latino communities. Just by comparison, 54% of white Americans, 53% of Native Americans, and 70% of Asian Americans have gotten at least one shot. Now, these inequities reflect a number of complicated issues, including a lack of medical resources in underserved communities. Health officials have struggled to convince many people that the vaccine is really free and there aren't hidden costs that'll come later, and been working very hard, particularly in Latino communities, to convince residents that getting the vaccine won't affect their immigration status. So to sum up, health officials have already reached the so-called low-hanging fruit. Those people who absolutely want to get vaccinated without you having to tell them anything at all. What we're left with now is the group that we need, trusted messengers who can go out there and explain why it's critical for themselves and their families to get the vaccines. There's recent polling that shows about 1/3 of Americans have no immediate plans to get vaccinated. And some people saying that they become more skeptical over time because they feel like the pandemic is no longer a threat. But the key point is this. Public health experts say the nation needs widespread immunity to prevent a resurgence of cases later this year when the weather gets colder. And right now, we're not on track to achieve those levels of immunity. We're making progress, but not quickly enough. Look, COVID-19 isn't going to end with a bang or a parade or on a magic date like VJ Day or VE Day after World War II. Throughout history, pandemics have ended when the disease ceases to dominate daily life and then gradually retreats into the background like other health challenges. And that happens when enough people are vaccinated. I know we're going to have plenty of questions on this topic, but let's move on because I do want to talk briefly about the January 6th Commission and particularly events of just this morning that might reopen the possibility for that commission to come in existence and examine the violence that overtook the Capitol on January 6th of this year. All right, let's start with a fairly basic premise. Let's start with the premise that when an armed mob invades the US Capitol and threatens the lives of members of Congress, it seems reasonable to investigate the causes of the violence, if only to keep it from happening again. But Republicans in Congress understand that a January 6th bipartisan commission would likely focus on Donald Trump. And they recognize that the commission's findings could really hurt their prospects in the midterm elections next year. So they used the filibuster for the first time to keep a January 6th commission bill from passing, and it looked like it was dead. But now it looks like there's two politicians, Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic House Speaker, and Susan Collins, the Republican senator from Maine, aren't quite ready to give up. Now, in the days before the Senate vote over a week ago, Collins led the effort to find a compromise that would allow a January 6th commission to move forward. Republicans had objected to the fact that Democrats would hire the commission staff and that the investigation, the inquiry, could last into 2022, into the election year. So Collins was able to convince Senate Democrats to divide the staff hiring decisions equally between the two parties, and also convince them to commit to concluding the commission's work by the end of 2021. So she was able to get several other Republicans to join her in supporting the creation of the commission, but she came up just a few votes short. But then Pelosi spoke up, and the Speaker brought up the idea of an other vote in the House as a way of increasing pressure on Republican senators. So why would that change anything if the House brought this up again? Well, for a couple reasons. One, when Collins was able to achieve her compromises on the original legislation, she became extremely angry at Chuck Schumer, the Democratic Senate Majority Leader, because she felt that he presented the bill in a way that she felt undermined the potential for greater Republican support. Collins said that she believed that Schumer was more interested in having the issue for Democratic candidates to run on next year than actually setting up the commission. And if he really wanted the commission, he would have presented it in a way that would have made it more clear that the Democrats were supporting Collins' changes, which she believes may have picked up more votes. But now it looks like Pelosi may be willing to give Collins another chance to pick up those last few votes by passing that compromise bill through the House of Representatives and then moving it to the Senate. Now, there's other options available too. A bipartisan commission created by Congress and modeled on the commission that examined the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 would be the ideal alternative in my mind. But Pelosi's also raised the prospect of appointing a select congressional committee, sort of along the lines of how Republicans investigated the terrorist attacks on the US consulate in Benghazi, Libya in 2012. The downside is a select committee might be viewed through what was likely to be viewed through a partisan lens. But Pelosi might decide that the value of making the information public about what really happened that day could outweigh that disadvantage. Now, there's several other standing committees in both the House and the Senate that are looking into the events of January 6th. But none of them are looking at the role that Trump himself played, because they believe that that would undermine the bipartisanship that we're now seeing in these committees. So in particular, the Senate Rules Committee and the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committees released their findings just this morning on a bipartisan basis. And they focused on security problems that existed in the Capitol that made it so vulnerable on January 6th. And they also revealed the fact that there was considerable prior intelligence in advance about possible violence that day. But the Senate committee did not examine Trump's actions for the reasons I mentioned earlier. But these committees coming forward with their reports about the lack of preparation in the Capitol, that could increase Pelosi's leverage. And so keep an eye on the speaker to use this morning's report as a jumping off point for her next move. Now, leading Republicans know that damning information regarding Trump's actions that day could create a huge obstacle for their party's candidates next November. But now what they have to think about is whether they'd rather have some say in the content and timing of a January 6th report, or whether they'd allow the Democrats to leverage both what was in the report and when it's released for their maximum political benefit. Now, most Republicans are not going to go against Trump on this. But Pelosi and Collins only need 3 more Republican senators to pass the bill. And so let's see if Pelosi thinks it's worth another try before she goes to a more partisan approach. Because while the majority of Republican senators will not support this, they're only 3 short. And the new report out today and Pelosi's more bipartisan approach is contrasted to what Collins believes that Schumer did not do, might just create another opportunity. So we'll see. In the meantime, though, more immediately, let's move on to our third topic. And that topic, as Kim mentioned earlier, is that President Biden is taking his first overseas trip this week. He'll be traveling first to Great Britain and then to Brussels, first for meetings with the G7 summit this weekend in Great Britain. And then he'll continue on to Belgium for a meeting with NATO and with European Union leaders. And then he'll sit down next week for his head-to-head meeting with Vladimir Putin in Geneva. And we'll talk about the Putin meeting next week. But the sequencing of events, meeting with the US's historical allies before seeing Putin face-to-face, is a very, very conscious sequencing on Biden's part to coordinate with allies to send a message to Putin that he, Biden, is not approaching Russia alone, but as part of a multinational coalition. Now, Biden sees his presidency as a key moment in world history. He likes to say that we're in a competition between democracies and autocracies. And then in order to win that competition, democracies need to demonstrate that they can still deliver for the people. That's why when he talks about his domestic agenda, he talks not only about Americans, but he also talks about winning the global competition with autocracies like China and Russia. And as we've talked about many times before, of course, he's also an avowed multilateralist. And he believes that the US will be better prepared for that competition if it rebuilds its relationships with democratic allies around the world. And he's taking that message on the road this week for the first time to test his belief that the US can better confront adversaries by embracing allies. The bottom line for Biden this week in Europe, he's not Donald Trump. Biden wants to work with the Western democracies. He wants to strengthen the US relationships with them. And he wants to be able to call on them when he needs them. So how's that message going to be received? On one hand, Europe is very happy to have America back in its traditional leadership role. But European leaders also know that this could flip back again in 3 years if another more populist nationalist president is elected in 2024. So they're proceeding with some caution and some wariness. And European leaders are still eager to see how Biden's going to approach international issues as president, mainly because of his lack of emphasis on those issues during his first months in office. So 3 big issues for Biden at the G7 this weekend. We'll call them the 3 C's: COVID, climate change, and cyber theft. And then the 4th C is China, of course. Now, Biden's Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, has already worked out a deal with her colleagues from the other G7 countries on a minimum international tax that would make it harder for global corporations to avoid their tax obligations. So that's already set, which means there's going to be a win for Biden to announce, no matter how things go on those other 3 issues. Last week, and so let's talk about those other 3 issues briefly, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Excuse me. So last week, Biden announced the US would donate 25 million doses of surplus COVID vaccine overseas. Now he said he's going to up that commitment to 80 million doses. But at the G7 and at the NATO meetings, he's going to lean on these other countries to do much more for all the reasons we discussed on the first topic today. Then he'll make a similar effort to convince those wealthier countries to do more to help developing nations deal with climate change. So most of the G7 nations have already set very ambitious goals for greenhouse gas reductions on their own. But the next step is providing the necessary financial and technological and logistical support for the rest of the world. So Biden's 2 big goals with the G7 is to get the wealthier companies to make more of an effort to help developing nations around the world on COVID and on climate change. And while there's not much to be done yet on some of the cyber ransoms we've seen recently, Biden has made it very clear that he believes that the only way to push back against this online piracy is through a multinational worldwide effort. In these meetings will be the first steps in developing an international coalition to fight back. And of course, it will be an issue that he raises in his summit next week with Vladimir Putin. So now if the G7 meeting is about economics, NATO is about global security. And Biden's going to make it clear at the NATO meeting that he needs their cooperation and support, not only in dealing with Russia, but with China too. And even though this is a North Atlantic security organization, of course, we're very likely to see NATO engaging on the Pacific Rim in the near future in order to support the US and its Pacific Rim allies in confronting China. Then the other main focus of the NATO meeting is to talk about the threat that Biden and many of his European allies, our European allies, believe that Russia poses. And so that once again, the timing of this is instructive, and the timing on this is important, because as soon as Biden leaves his meeting on global security matters with NATO, well, then he goes to Geneva to sit down with Vladimir Putin. But when he sits down in that meeting with Putin next week, even though it will be a one-on-one, because Biden's coming directly from NATO and G7, he brings the support of a much broader alliance with him, which Biden believes, as we talked about many times before with both Russia and China, is going to be the key to any successes in dealing with either of those two potential threats. So we're right at the bottom of the hour. We're at 11:30, and I'm going to apologize, as I think all of you noticed, we did not put up polling questions today, and that was just a matter of an internal snafu, and I apologize for that. We'll get back to that format next week. But for those of you who stuck with me, even without the polling questions, let's bring Jessica on, and let's see what the questions are that all of you have to end the conversation. Hi, Jessica.
Hello. All right, our first question, only 49.6% of Americans are fully vaccinated. Do you expect surges in various states after July 4th or Labor Day?
I think it's less likely that we're going to see surges over the summer unless an unexpected variant emerges that the vaccines don't protect us against. But because a larger percentage of Americans have had at least one vaccine dose, and because those generally seem to be offering a pretty good level of protection, I think the real challenge is not going to be over the summer, either 4th of July or Labor Day, because the crowd gatherings probably don't create nearly as much of a challenge as they did with an unvaccinated community. But the real challenge comes later in the year when the temperature gets cold again. And that's when variants might become more of a threat. So while Biden set a goal of vaccinating 70% of the country by July 4th, and it now looks like that's unlikely to be met, the much more important, substantive, less symbolical, would be reaching higher levels by early mid-fall. So by the time the weather does start to get cold in some parts of the country, we're as well prepared as possible for that challenge.
UCLA released a report documenting that big states that instituted more stringent measures, for example, California, not only had fewer per capita infections, but also stronger 2020 GDP than big states that had looser restrictions, for example, Florida and Texas. Do you have any comment?
Well, there've been a number of studies released, UCLA's among them, with a wide range of findings about the relative economic successes and challenges faced by states, both large and small, based on their social distancing policies. It is clear that along with the state of Vermont, certainly not one of the larger states, but along with the state of Vermont, California has done the best job of any state in the country in terms of vaccinating its residents. And that lays the groundwork for a much more considerable economic upturn in the months ahead as people can return to their workplaces, to places of commerce, to restaurants, to shops, and so on. So the higher vaccination rates here in California are going to help in the future. Whether it's helped California's economy more or less in the past than less stringent approaches in states like Florida and Texas, that's still really an unresolved question. And there's a great deal of data on both sides of the debate to argue whether more ambitious social distancing measures did help economically or not. But going forward, it's sure to be a considerable net benefit. It's one that, while I know we have a number of audience members who join us from other parts of the country, for those of us in California, the progress we've made on vaccinations is going to yield not only health but economic benefits. But as I said earlier, it's very critical for the state to redouble its efforts in underrepresented minority communities to make sure those protections and those economic opportunities are available to everyone in the state.
What legal restrictions or penalties could be imposed on those who refuse to be vaccinated? Travel, school, other?
Well, the legal penalties are somewhat problematic because I think most governments, and certainly our federal government, has made the decision that there should not be legal punishment attached to an individual who chooses not to be vaccinated. That said, it's becoming very clear that an increasing number of businesses are going to make it more challenging for those who choose not to get vaccines to function. Air travel is going to become increasingly difficult for those without vaccinations. Despite the confusion over California's reopening next week, one thing is very clear, that only those with vaccinations will be able to engage in public and restaurants and stores and so on without a mask, but those who don't have vaccinations are going to be expected to keep wearing them. So as opposed to a legal restriction, I think what you're more likely to see are matters of convenience and opportunity for those who choose to get vaccinations. And the gamble that both state and federal officials are taking is that when the unvaccinated see the types of opportunities that are available to those who've gotten their vaccines, that's going to encourage more people to move forward and get the shots and get the doses on their own.
Vaccines in developing world. I read that Sierra Leone is doing well with vaccines based on what it learned about decentralizing its approach after dealing with Ebola. Do you know whether other developing countries also know how to distribute vaccines and convince populations to take because of their own experiences dealing with health issues?
Well, as we saw in Asia earlier this year, those countries that had dealt with SARS some years ago were much better prepared to convince their populations to respect social distancing restrictions and therefore avoid the worst of the shutdowns and the restrictions that came with them. No question that those countries like Sierra Leone that dealt with Ebola have learned some valuable lessons as well. But the biggest challenge in Africa is not lack of knowledge, but lack of resources, the lack of health facilities, the lack of trained medical professionals, and a widespread skepticism in those countries that were not as seriously affected by Ebola as to the value of the vaccines. So Africa, Latin America, the Pacific Rim, one of the things we'll be seeing this weekend at the G7 is Biden and Boris Johnson attempting strenuously to convince their colleagues that there needs to be more financial and logistical support to developing nations around the world.
This questioner asks on the topic of surplus vaccines, why is Taiwan's 23 million population essentially being blocked from receiving surplus vaccines from the US? Only 750,000 doses is insufficient. If China is blocking it, then isn't US policy of protecting Taiwan thus being hypocritical?
I have to admit, it's a fascinating question, but I will admit I simply was not aware of the small number of doses that have gone to Taiwan, and I don't know whether that's the result of geopolitics with China or whether it's a reflection of the relatively small number of doses that the US has made available to other countries up until now. The United States, the Biden administration, made the decision at the beginning of their administration to focus on providing vaccines to US residents. And while now they're going to provide a very large number, a very generous number of doses to the rest of the world, there's been some months in passing. Now, China and Russia, both in different corners of the world, have filled that gap by providing vaccine doses of their own. It's not surprising that China did not provide doses to Taiwan. I will do some more research on this, and I'll apologize to the questioner. But my gut instinct is that while as the Biden administration is increasing the US military presence and the waters surrounding Taiwan, and as they've announced upcoming trade agreements with Taiwan, it would seem peculiar that given the more confrontational tack that the US has taken vis-a-vis Taiwan with mainland China, it seems odd that they would make an exception to that on vaccines. My guess it has more to do with the delay of providing doses to the rest of the world and the fact that China is not going to be providing doses to Taiwan than a considered decision on the US's part to adhere to China's admonitions or warnings. But I can't say that is a fact. It's just an instinct as opposed to as opposed to knowledge? And it's a fascinating question. So thank you.
Some companies have stated that they will not hire people who have not been vaccinated. Is this a form of discrimination, and will it be challenged in court?
It will be challenged in court, and of course the courts will decide whether it is discrimination or not. My guess, and it's just a guess, is that the courts are going to give private businesses a lot of latitude and a lot of leeway in making these types of decisions. The relevant authorities here in California announced last Thursday, after a very confusing back and forth meeting, that in workplaces, employees would not have to wear masks unless a member of the workforce in that workplace was not vaccinated. So theoretically, you could have an office with dozens, if not hundreds of people, and if one person chose not to be vaccinated, then everyone in that office space would have to wear masks. I suspect as the hiring cycle continues that I'd say logistical constraints that businesses face, social distancing, space availability, will make it harder for them to hire the unvaccinated. And it is just, once again, it's just a guess. I think the courts will be pretty forgiving on businesses that make those sorts of decisions. Every American has the legal right not to get a vaccine if they want, but not every American has the legal right to work in a certain place of employment. And my forecast on this is most courts will make their decisions based on that distinction.
Thank you. On the topic of the January 6th Commission, even if an inquiry was launched into January 6th, don't you agree that Republicans and Democrats will contest the results?
Democrats and Republicans, of course, will contest the results, but there's a huge block of swing voters in the middle, either registered independents or more centrist Democrats or Republicans who aren't quite so consistent in following their own party's lines. So any political debate in this country is not about persuading the entire country. It's about persuading that undecided middle. And I believe, as I think the congressional leaders of both parties also believe, is that a bipartisan commission's findings are more likely to be persuadable toward that middle portion of the electorate than a committee that's completely run by one party or the other. So you're right, the hardcores on both sides are never going to have their minds changed. But that middle swath is enough to move forward depending on their feelings about these types of issues. So a genuine bipartisan commission, I think, would be a preferable alternative to a select committee. But if Pelosi makes another try to get those last three Republican senators on board and fails, then my prediction, I don't like predictions, as you know, but I'll make it here, is Pelosi will decide that a glass half full is better than an empty one, and that a select committee that can make findings of that day public is a worthwhile effort, even if it's not taken as seriously by that middle portion of the electorate as a bipartisan commission would be. So a Benghazi type committee isn't ideal. It's certainly not as good as a 9/11 type commission, but ultimately I would bet that Democratic leadership decides it would be better than nothing.
Can the January 6th report be started and agreed to be released after the 2022 midterm elections? Therefore, the report can't be viewed as a political weapon.
It could be. Theoretically, there's two challenges there. And actually, it's worth noting that it was more than a year after the terrorist attacks of September 11th that Congress was ultimately able to resolve its differences and move forward with with that bipartisan commission. So it's not as if things fell into place just magically 20 years ago either. So while it's logistically possible for Congress to come to those conclusions, I think there's two potential obstacles that would keep that from being a viable option. One, of course, is leaks. There's nothing that would prevent staff hired by either side from leaking out piecemeal information about their findings. I think the only thing worse than not having any additional information about January 6th is having it piecemeal and not in an overall full context. The other potential challenge is presumably you'd want to do an investigation like this, as I said earlier, in order to learn enough to keep these types of attacks from happening in the future. And so if the commission delayed its work for a year, in other words, even if that commission knew what could be done to make the US Capitol safer from that type of violence, but wasn't releasing the information or acting on it, there's a considered case to be made that delaying the release of that information and putting innocent lives at risk should outweigh the political considerations of a midterm election. So it is possible, but my guess is that a commission completed with its work by the end of the calendar year 2021 is still the most likely option, whether it's a 9/11 style bipartisan commission or whether it's the type of select committee that Pelosi may decide to fall back on should she not be successful in her first option.
Is there anything to be gained by having a commission investigate the causes and instigators of violence in Portland and Seattle?
Well, it's a great question. It's a really smart question, because one of the original points of argument between Republicans and Democrats on a January 6th commission is whether it should include broader examples of this type of violence, such as that we saw most notably in Portland, but in Seattle and Chicago and many other cities as well. And Republicans understand that if the commission were to have a broader purview, it'd be less likely to focus on Donald Trump's actions of January 6th. Democrats argue, well, aside from preferring the focus on Trump on January 6th, they do argue, Democrats, that it was a violent attack on the US Capitol is a fundamentally different type of threat than the types of unrest we saw on the streets of the nation's cities over the course of the year. The questioner raises a great point, which is even if you're not going to examine that broader outbreak of violence in the context of a January 6th commission, should it not be examined in some type of other context? And my first reaction is, of course it should. And while that's not going to be a satisfactory conclusion for hardcore partisans on either side, it seems to me that the Democrats could earn some significant political points if they were to say, let's keep this bipartisan commission focused solely on January 6th, but yes, let's also look into the broader examples of unrest our nation's cities have seen in recent months. I think it's a great idea. Way to go, questioner.
Way to go, Cy. Next question. Assuming Senate Republicans and Joe Manchin continue to oppose the omnibus bills that the House has passed, do you think it makes sense for Schumer to pursue the lowest hanging fruit by seeking to pass bills that have the greatest popular support?
Well, I think Schumer has no choice. And one of the things that's puzzling to me in watching some of the more progressive Democrats' reaction to Joe Manchin over the last few days, since he reiterated his opposition to the Voting Rights Act as it's currently constituted and his current support for the filibuster, I'm not sure what they think they're going to get by attacking Manchin. You know, when you attack a United States senator, he or she very rarely says, oh my goodness, I've rethought it, now I'm on your side. What it generally tends to do is it drives them drives them even further in the other direction. It's been instructive that the most critical voices raised against Manchin over the last few days have come from House Democrats. And even though there are progressive Democrats in the Senate who are just as unhappy with him as their House colleagues are, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Ron Wyden, and others are smart enough to know that publicly attacking Manchin does not increase the chances of getting him to work with them, but rather it decreases it. And so calling Manchin the new Jim Crow, the new Mitch McConnell, people can disagree on whether those are appropriate insults or not. My only point is they're not particularly productive ones because they're unlikely to convince Manchin to become more supportive than he already has been. And as long as there are only 50 Democrats in the Senate, that means that except on very rare pieces of legislation where Republicans might come over and join the majority, getting a half a loaf with Manchin is better than getting no bread at all from criticizing and attacking him on a regular basis.
I think if Manchin starts a podcast, I think you should call it Half a Loaf of Manchin. I like that.
That's really good.
Yeah. On climate change, is giving money to other countries, mainly developing countries, helpful in help combat climate change, a way that the Biden administration is competing with China's Belt and Road Initiative as well as climate change?
Another really smart question is, while there's real world, substantive, quantitative reasons to fight climate change, and for that matter, to increase the spread of vaccinations to fight COVID, there are certainly geopolitical gains to be realized as well. And China, whether it's on the Belt and Road Initiative with infrastructure and economic development help to developing countries, or the distribution of COVID vaccines that China has made to Latin America and Africa and other places around the world, the Chinese are realizing a considerable advantage by working with these other countries. And so while the Biden administration certainly wants to fight climate change and COVID on its own merits, I think the questioner is right that they do also see an opportunity to balance off the equation and not give China such an advantage in terms of public perception in these countries by engaging more forcefully on behalf of this country.
Thank you. This questioner says, interesting that there's more concern about the non-vaccinated than open carry legislation. Does that speak to our values as a nation?
I don't know if it's a value question as much as it is a health question. Open carry is a legitimate policy discussion to have, and perhaps it's one for us to discuss on this webinar at some point in the future. But the existential threat that a communicable disease like the coronavirus poses to the world suggests to me that it's appropriate that we do give it as much attention as we can, and that one of the reasons that this country struggled for such a long time to deal with COVID until the vaccines became available is because we didn't focus on it, or at least large pockets of our country did not focus on it to the degree that we needed to.
Is there an element of desperation that world leaders see as Biden tries to overturn Trump's isolationist policies?
Is there a level of desperation? I assume the questioner means on the part of other world leaders as they see Biden taking this different course. And you're probably right.
I'm trying to interpret if they're saying desperation of Biden or desperation from the world leaders. Is there an element of desperation that world leaders see as Biden tries to overturn Trump's isolationist policy? So I guess that the world leaders are perceiving.
The world leaders are perceiving that Biden is desperate. Well, we'll take a crack at both. I don't think the world leaders are perceiving Biden to be desperate. I think most world leaders, especially the U.S.'s historical allies, are somewhat relieved to see Biden reverting to historical norms in terms of the U.S. relationship with Western Europe and with the rest of the world. So I think it's less them thinking that Biden is desperate and more, as I mentioned earlier, them worried that no matter how committed Biden is to this approach, they witnessed in 2016 an election in which an American president committed to a much more nationalistic approach and a much different ideology. So even if they take Biden at face value, they no longer look at the United States as the constant presence that they did for many, many years prior, because they realized that the election of a more nationalist president of either party could reverse the trajectory that Biden has implemented since taking office. And just to be careful, are the world leaders desperate? I think desperate is overstating it, but I think the U.S.'s traditional allies are very, very grateful to see the United States reasserting its traditional role on the world stage, particularly as it relates to Russia and particularly as it relates to China. A little bit less excitement as it relates to the US role in the Middle East. I think it was noticeable how quiet many European countries were when Biden weighed in the recent conflict between Israel and Hamas. But on the biggest ticket items, China and Russia, so desperation is a little strong, but relief and gratitude, I think, is probably a more appropriate way of describing their sentiments.
There might be fundamental difference between Portland and Seattle versus other city demonstrations, but there is a potential great deal of similarity between unrest in Michigan and other places where there was direct threats to state or local governments. Your thoughts?
Well, it's a very fair point that the attacks in Michigan, particularly on the state capitol there, do have something in common with the attacks on the US Capitol. What I would say is that you have to draw the line somewhere, and that trying to define which violence was directed against governments and which violence was directed against a broader community or a subsect of it requires a level of precision that I don't possess. And therefore, my instinct would be to look at January 6th as part of a standalone commission investigation, but to recognize as part of the broader investigation that the earlier questioner recommended, to recognize that there are all sorts of variables involved. In Lansing, Michigan, they attacked the state, rioters attacked the state capitol. In Portland, they attacked government buildings. In Minneapolis, they attacked police stations. So I don't know that there's a way to neatly differentiate between government-directed violence and broader violence. I'd be satisfied, given the broader political landscape on which we currently occupy, that looking at Washington and the US Capitol is a unique event, and then trying to encompass the wide range of violent activity that we've seen in recent months as a separate investigation is probably our best available option.
Thank you. What do you think of some cruise lines announcing reopening this summer with vaccinations optional because of the law signed by DeSantis in Florida?
Well, it's interesting because most of the world's largest cruise lines have decided not to sail and are essentially threatening Governor DeSantis and saying that rather than embarking from Florida ports, they'll embark instead from various locations, either in states slightly to the north or throughout the Caribbean. In other words, most cruise lines are not going to back down from their mandates for vaccines in order to port in Florida. A few will, and I suspect customers will make their decisions on which cruise lines to sail on for many factors, including the level of confidence they can have that their fellow passengers are vaccinated. So I think there's an awful lot of people that will decide that embarking from Miami or Fort Lauderdale is no longer desirable because the lack of assurance. I would say that if DeSantis and the Florida state government does not back down, you're going to see the cruise line industry embark on pretty serious relocations in order to avoid Florida altogether. There's a potential compromise brewing, I understand, but that's a longer conversation which we'll probably have to come back to in a future webinar.
Sounds good. Well, that is the end of our hour. That flew by again, and apologize again to our audience for not having the poll questions today, but we'll make sure we have them next week. So make sure to join us next Tuesday. And Kim, I'll turn this back over to you.
Thank you, Jessica.
Jessica, great job on the questions and fabulous questions from the audience as always. Great job, Dan. We need more time.
Well, thank you, Kim. You're really nice, and as always, I really enjoyed it. I hope the audience did too.
As many of you know, every other week, Dan gives us an additional half hour after these sessions in a different format where our members can talk directly to Dan and have more back and forth conversation as a continuation of these webinars, Politics in the Time of Coronavirus. So if that's something that is of interest to you, please check out our website and sign up, become a member, and you get more of Dan time. I love it. We have some terrific upcoming programs. Let me just give you a quick highlight, and then Dan and I are going to transition to this next after the webinar program. Tomorrow, a year of reckoning, assessing the state of racism and discrimination in America from COVID-19 to 2021. And then next week, in addition to Dan, who of course is every Tuesday at 11 o'clock, we have on June 17th, Latin America's Changing International Role, a conversation with Abe Lowenthal. And on the 16th, Looking Beyond a Two-State Solution, Alternatives in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, which is, as you know, we're a nonpartisan organization, and we already had a program on Israeli relations, which Dan moderated. So he's going to do a counterpoint for us in that program. So please go to our website, sign up today, view past programs, make a donation. Please stay informed, and we'll hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so
Dan.
much.